I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners! Before we begin this edition of the program, I want to remind you that you can support my work on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. With that out of the way, I know a lot's been going on this week. We have the Trump-Iran news, we have the Trump tariffs, and that whole thing that's been playing out for the past few days. And then, of course, we have the horrors still unfolding in Gaza and Netanyahu's recent visit to the U.S. as well. There's a lot going on. But one thing you may have missed, or maybe not because it's garnered a lot of attention online, is the recent congressional hearing on the JFK assassination. That was part of the task force on the declassification of federal secrets, chaired by Republican Representative Anna Paulina Luna. Returning guest and co-screenwriter of Oliver Stone's JFK Revisited, Jim DiEugenio, attended this recent hearing. In fact, testified at this hearing. We're going to talk about his insider perspective on the Luna hearing. Now, whether or not you believe there was a conspiracy behind JFK's murder, this isn't just about grassy knolls or magic bullets. It's about something much bigger: public trust in our institutions and the right to know what's been done in our name. You see, the JFK files that have been slowly trickling out since the 1992 JFK Records Act aren't just about the assassination. Many of these files are actually enhancing our understanding of the CIA, covert operations, and U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. We have a right to know our history. That's why this issue is important. The final files should be released because they will enhance our understanding of history, and because, let's face it, we are at a moment where institutional trust is at an all-time low. One way to restore that is through efforts to bring about transparency. This is a perfect way to do that, or at least that's the argument that Jim DiEugenio makes in the conversation to follow. So, with that being said, let's get right to it with Jim DiEugenio. Welcome back to Parallax Views. A guest who I consider to be a friend of the show at this point. He's been on a number of times. We've talked about everything from the Kennedy assassination to the state of film and cinema. Jim DiEugenio is a veteran JFK researcher, author of Destiny Betrayed and the JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today, as well as the screenwriter on Oliver Stone's JFK Revisited. And we're going to be talking about the Luna hearing, which Jim attended. He gave testimony at that. And how are you doing, Jim?
Fine. It's been a kind of busy last few days, but outside of that, I'm decelerating.
So, for my listeners, because I cover so many different topics on this show, if they don't know what has happened since January, what has been going on since the Trump executive order, and how did this hearing come about?
Well, as I said in the hearing, and by the way, that hearing is all over YouTube. So if you missed it, there's about 6 places that actually have the complete hearing. Okay, and about 25 other ones you have excerpts. There's like 2.6 million views of this thing. All right. So when people say nobody's interested in the JFK case, well, you better explain it to those millions of people. Okay. This is how this happened. See, Trump was supposed to have declassified all the JFK documents back in 2017. And on the day he was supposed to do that, he got visited by Mike Pompeo and some other people in the intel community. And they advised him, very unwisely, I believe, to not go ahead with it. So he took that faulty advice. He did declassify some documents, but not all of them. Now, the baton passed on to Joe Biden, who dropped it right in the middle of the track, okay, because he did about the same thing that Trump did, maybe kind of even worse in some respects. So then during the last campaign, candidate Trump was questioned about his failure to do this by both Mr. Rogan and Mr. Napolitano. All right. In fact, Napolitano made public a phone call he had with Trump, okay, in which he basically said, you know, you broke your promise to the American people. And Trump said, what do you mean? He goes, you told them you were going to declassify the last of the JFK documents, and then you didn't. And Trump said something like, Andrew, if they would have showed you what they showed me, you'd have understood. And Napolitano said, who was they and what did they show you? And Trump said something like, if next time when there's not 15 people listening to the phone call, we'll talk about it. All right. So, anyway, this is the reason I believe that in January, Trump issued this executive order to declassify everything. And Tulsi Gabbard wrote over a lot of objections and decided to go ahead. And what's remarkable about this release is how few redactions there are. As a veteran researcher, I understand that usually the FBI or the CIA will black out some of the document. But in many of these, the vast majority of these that I've seen so far, okay, they're pretty much clean. You know, now Anna Luna decided to put together this committee on government secrecy.
This is the congresswoman from Florida
Right, the
that's heading this up.
congresswoman from Florida, yes. And she decided that the leadoff case, she cited several others like the origins of CV-19, the 9/11 files, Epstein, okay, etc. But she decided that the lead case was going to be on the John F. Kennedy assassination. So she called this hearing and she invited Jeff Morley and Oliver Stone, and Oliver Stone invited me to go along with him. And so at this hearing, we tried to provide some background information, okay, on the JFK case. All right. And let me tell you what was surprising to me about this. First of all, when me and Oliver got to Washington, there was a meeting in Luna's office on the Monday before the Tuesday hearing. I expected there to be just me, Oliver, Jeff Morley, the committee assistant, a guy named Jake, and her. We walked into her office. There were 11 or 12 people there. You know, two other people from the committee, several of their assistants. It was standing room only. Okay. So that was my first surprise. Then my second surprise was when we got to the hearing. It was the Republicans who were all there, who stayed, who asked the most pertinent questions, and were most interested in the facts of the case. There were, I believe, only 4 Democrats there, and none of them seemed very interested in either what had been released in the files or the subject matter at hand. And as this went on, because the hearing lasted for over 2.5 hours, I was really perplexed at this. I really was. I mean, the obvious reason being, of course, that JFK was a Democrat. All right. And so was his brother. And so was King. Well, we don't know about King, but King was allied with the Kennedys. All right. And I began to really think about this. And I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but I speculate that the reason they did this was that they wanted to side with the FBI because of Trump's big dispute with the FBI. All right. Over the whole Russiagate, you know, that whole battle that Trump had with the Bureau. And in my speech, as you can see on YouTube, my opening remarks, I said that the FBI did not do a very good job, and that's putting it mildly, in the JFK case. And then I concluded by saying that the FBI and the CIA should not have the last word on Kennedy's assassination. All right. So after thinking about this matter for a while, that's the best reason I could come to. All right. For those Democrats to show up for only half an hour, all right, and B, not support the general attitude that the rest of the committee had. And by the way, if you watch the hearing, Garcia, who was the ranking member, went right after Jeff Morley. Okay. And he said words to the effect, what is the direct evidence you have of CIA involvement in the Kennedy assassination? If that would have been me, you know what I would have said? I would have said, Mr. Garcia, I don't know if you know this, but the CIA specializes in covert operations. They are masterful at not leaving any trace behind of their involvement. Okay. They've been doing it for something like 50 years now. All right. So they become very good at it. By the time of the JFK assassination, they've been in operation for 15 years. All right. Um, so this is what really kind of tugged at my noggin a little bit. Well, more than a little bit, you know. Um, and I think it's just a ghastly state of affairs. I really do, you know. So that was one of the things. Now, if you watch the hearing, the document that was released that I chose to talk about was the Schlesinger memo.
I wanted
This
to delve into that more deeply. Thank you.
good. All right. What was the Schlesinger memo? After the Bay of Pigs operation, Kennedy decided that the CIA had deliberately lied to him about almost every aspect of this ill-fated invasion of Cuba, right? From the element of surprise to the element of knowledge to how many people were going to come in on the side of the Cuban exiles, which ended up being none. Okay. So he instructed his advisor, Arthur Schlesinger, to go ahead and map out a whole top down reorganization of the Central Intelligence Agency. This 15 or 16 page memo, if you can believe it, it was written in 1961. As late as a couple months ago, it had been redacted. Now, we're talking 60 years. 60 years, and they're still redacting 2 pages of this memo. Now, the combination of Trump and Gabbard went ahead and declassified the whole thing. So for the first time, we now have the entire memo. It turns out that the 2 pages that had been redacted deal with Schlesinger's numbers on how much of the State Department was really CIA. In other words, these people masquerading as State Department employees in various embassies throughout the world were really CIA agents undercover. He specifically pointed to the Paris embassy, where he said there's 128 CIA agents in that embassy. They occupy the whole top floor. All right. Now, why is that so important? Because these guys were involved in the attempt to overthrow de Gaulle. All right. Because the CIA was in bed with the so-called secret army organization, the OAS, which was going to try and overthrow de Gaulle over the dispute over Algeria, because de Gaulle was amenable to granting Algeria its independence. All right. Now, he also concluded that overall, and this is really an amazing statistic, 47% of these State Department staffs were secretly CIA. I mean, that's really something, you know? And so Schlesinger was trying to make the point that how can you run your State Department if half of them are CIA agents? All right. All right. And so those 2 pages were redacted until January. Now, here's something that's, I believe, in more interesting. Prior to the construction of the Assassinations Record Review Board, which was put together from 1994 to 1998 to specifically declassify all the records on the JFK assassination. Prior to that, the CIA had redacted over 60% of the Schlesinger memo, because a friend of mine, Andrew Eiler, got a copy of it from the pre-review board days. Of the remaining 5 pages, about 40% of those were redacted. Now, first of all, the CIA had no business redacting that memo at all because it was a White House document. All right. But because they have what is called equity, what they call in Washington, they have equity in the document because part of it concerns them. They went ahead and did that to the Schlesinger memo. And so this is the point I made. How in earth can you have an informed citizenry when stuff like this is happening? You cannot be fully informed of this dispute between the CIA and the White House at that time. All right. Now, this is very, very important, okay, because during this attempt to overthrow de Gaulle, JFK got on the phone with the French ambassador in Washington and said, look, most of the time, I don't know what these guys are doing. All right. So I can't even tell you if we're involved in this overthrow attempt. All right. I'd be willing to send over the Seventh Fleet if you want me to. Okay. But I really cannot tell you if we're covertly involved with this attempt at a coup in Paris. All right. And this is another thing that urged JFK to go ahead and map out this reorganization plan. Now, the problem was that he couldn't get through the guy that he wanted as his new director. He met with a lot of resistance on this. Okay. And so he decided to go ahead and drop the idea, and he settled for John McCone because he thought McCone was an outsider. He wasn't a part of the Good Old Boys Network. And then he fired the top three guys, um, Dulles, Bissell, and Cabell. Okay. By the way, when I said this on Fox, I was on the Waters show. I said, JFK decapitated the top level of the CIA. And Waters fired back as quick as a hiccup. And then he got decapitated by a bullet.
This was the appearance that you did with Oliver Stone?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I watched that. Yeah.
Oh, good. By the way, I have to tell you, the impact of this hearing is really remarkable. In addition to all those millions of people on YouTube, me and Oliver and Jeff Morley and Matt Crumpton did about, I think, 5 or 6 appearances on television. And I tallied up the ratings for them, and Waters gets almost 4 million people a night. All right. And then Morley did it one night. Me and Oliver did it another. And in the combination of all the shows comes to something like 8 million. All right. And if you combine that with the YouTube, we're approaching 11 million. That number is approaching 11 million people. So this thing really, really did have an impact. All right. Now, if you didn't see it, we actually got to talk about some of the evidence in the JFK case. And I think, didn't you send me a Ben Shapiro column?
I was going to ask you about that, but I wanted to comment on something first, if I could.
Sure.
Can you hear
It's
me
your
okay
show.
still?
Yes.
Okay. So what I wanted to get at, this Schlesinger memo is very interesting to me because I think it highlights a point that I've always made about the JFK files, which is, these files need to be released not just because they can shed light on the assassination, but also because they shed light on things like the cowboy nature of the CIA at the time. They give us a fuller understanding of the Cold War, the conflicts between the agency and the White House. It gives us a better understanding of covert operations in that time. And this isn't the first time we've seen that. It was because of the Assassination Records Review Board that we know about Operation Northwoods, the planned false flag that would have been blamed on Cubans that came out of the Defense Department. It was the ARB that helped us discover that. And I feel like these characters, like Ben Shapiro saying, oh, it happened so long ago, why do you care about these files? It overlooks the fact that these files are giving us a fuller understanding of the Cold War and covert operations. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. And there's been several commentators who are not JFK assassination people who have gotten on things like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, and they've read through these things, and they've done just what you expressed. We now have a better understanding of what the CIA was doing in the third world as a result of these new files. And I cannot stress enough, all right, that this, I believe, is one of the reasons why the agency resisted, okay, doing this stuff, letting all this stuff go. And I think Tulsi, with Trump's backing, all right, she had the ability to actually let most of these go. In fact, I would say more than that, like 95, 96, 97% in their cleanest form, and they give us a picture now of just what, these operations uh, were about, and I actually think this is going to be a scholarly contribution to books about the CIA and the third world in in the future. Now, the Schlesinger memo, all right, 15 or 16 pages of it, they give us an idea of how Kennedy, you know, was so disappointed. All right. And he was trying to go ahead and see if he could actually control things a little bit more. All right. And by the way, I have to tell you, I don't know if you know this story. George Smathers was a friend of JFK's, and he told the church committee that Kennedy was very disappointed in some of the things that he learned about the CIA as time went on. Okay. He got very angry when this subject was brought up. And he said, you know, I'm trying to get control of what these guys are doing because most of the time I don't know what they're doing. So this is like 3 times that he said this, that I don't know what they're doing. All right. And he wanted to actually try and do something about these, these rogue operations that the CIA was performing, even at the time. Because in addition to the situation in Paris and the Bay of Pigs operation, there was the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, which Kennedy didn't find out about until like 3 weeks after it happened, you know. And Lumumba was assassinated, I think, 2 days before Kennedy was inaugurated. And there's some commentators who believe that that happened because they didn't want to see Lumumba around when JFK was president. So I believe the combination of those 3 things, the Bay of Pigs, the attempted overthrow of de Gaulle, and the assassination of Lumumba, those were the motivating factors, I think, for the Arthur Schlesinger memo.
I wanted to ask you as well about this surprise appearance by a figure by the name of John Davison. Who is he, and what was he doing there?
You know, I
Jim is shaking his
I
head, folks.
I have to tell you this since you asked the question. First of all, I never heard of this guy. Okay, had no idea who he was. And I was sitting next to him on the dais. So I turned to Jeff Morley and I said, "Who is this guy? And what is he doing here?" You know, and Jeff said words to the effect that he was going to go ahead and complain about certain social security numbers being declassified within these new batch of documents and how this was an invasion of privacy. And he then told me that it was a Democrat's idea to get him there. All right. And when I learned that and I added it together with only the 4 Democrats on the committee and the fact that they only stuck around, this is what really began to put the light on in my noggin, all right, about what the heck was going on. All right. And so I wrote an essay on this. It's on my Substack site about this particular issue. All right. Because look, this was supposed to be about what was in these files, what the information was in these files and how they related to the secrets of the Kennedy assassination. And it is utterly amazing to me, mind boggling actually, how the Democratic Party doesn't want any part of this. You know, uh, it's really a little bit disturbing, actually. All right, but to answer your question, that's my information from Jeff about what this man was doing there.
That actually was a good lead into another question. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about how you think Democrats are missing the boat on this and how there is an opportunity here for Democrats. I think this is a great opportunity for anyone who's an advocate of transparency, which is much needed at this point for restoring trust in our, institutions in this country. One thing I hear from Democrats a lot is they're wary of these hearings and the work Luna is doing because they'll say, "Oh, this is some kind of Republican op." Do you think they're, uh, you know, missing an opportunity? And how would you respond to the people who think, "Oh, this is just some type of Republican spectacle"?
I think the Democrats are missing a golden opportunity. All right. In fact, I really think that at base, this could be a really good way to advertise their brand. Let me give you one example of what I'm talking about. All four members of the Democratic Party who were there were from minority groups. Okay. JFK was the first president to sign an executive order about affirmative action. All right. I mean, come on. This is, why would you not want to talk about that? Why would you not want to revive that kind of record? All right. I mean, and as I said during the hearing, today we have a loss of belief in both the government and the press. And the loss of belief in government, the biggest single year plunge was 1964, the year the Warren Commission was issued. So you would want to think, like, oh, maybe that's a good issue. Maybe if we had more honesty and forthrightness about these assassinations of the 60s, maybe we can restore, some of that trust that was lost, you know. But the Democrats seem to you know, completely miss the boat on this. As for it being a Republican op, I don't buy that. I don't buy that for one single second. You know, I I've met Luna. Okay, I've met the guy who is the staff leader on the committee. All right, and they're both doing this because of just what the title says and what I said in my opening remarks. Secrecy is the enemy of democracy. You cannot run a democracy if you have all this stuff enshrouded in darkness. Let me give you one example about this because I think it's very, very important. If you recall, and I hate to say this, but I'm old enough to remember, when LBJ ran for election in 1964, he consistently said, "I will not send American boys to fight a war that Asian boys should be fighting." All right. And he hammered Goldwater, who was the Republican candidate that year. all right, over the Vietnam issue, that Goldwater couldn't be trusted because he would escalate the war. Now, I don't know if your listeners know this. The entire time that Johnson was saying this in public, he was secretly planning to escalate the war. Now, if the American public would have known that at the time, I mean, do you really think LBJ would have won in a landslide? I sure don't. Okay, you know, and it's this kind of duplicity that I believe strikes at the heart of the JFK assassination. Right, the Warren Commission report, and in part the House Select Committee, was made up of a lot of falsity. All right, and the Warren Commission, for example, if you want to read something really nauseating, read their sections on Oswald in Mexico City. All right. And you'll see something that is really a farce because it's very obvious. In fact, it ended up being true. When the Warren Commission went down to Mexico City, they did not talk to one person at the Cuban consulate. And the most important witness in the whole thing, of course, was Sylvia Duran, because she was the woman who interacted the most with was supposed to be Oswald. All right. So Mexico City happened 7 weeks before the assassination. And yet that visit, that supposed visit, was one thing that the Warren Commission used to brand Oswald as a communist. All right. But since the Warren Commission never had any information about what went on down there, we really didn't know anything about this. It wasn't until the House Select Committee under Dan Hardway and Eddie Lopez went to Mexico City and talked to these people that we actually understood something about what the heck was going on down there. And it's not what the Warren Commission report said it was. Let me give you another example. Does anybody really think that the FBI did not know what was going on at 544 Camp Street in the summer of 1963? I'm sorry, I don't believe it because I know for a fact that they were there. They were in Guy Bannister's office. All right. Okay. So they did know, and they did know the significance of that address being on the flyers that Oswald was passing around in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. So this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. All right. And this is the kind of thing that has caused the American public, I believe, to lose faith, not just in the government, not just in the government, but in the press. All right. Because if you take a look at the polls, the belief in the press is down there with the belief in the government. All right. And I believe that this is the hostility that the media has over people like me. All right. Because they don't want to be two failures, two blatant failures. Number one, they blew it on the JFK assassination by jumping on board the Warren report before they even read it. And I can prove they didn't read it if you want me to. All right, number one. And number two, they missed the reversal of policy on Vietnam. And in fact, when Oliver Stone's film came out in 91, he was bitterly attacked about bringing up this JFK withdrawal plan, from Vietnam. But guess what? He ended up being right because the review board declassified documents that we showed in JFK Revisited that proved Kennedy was withdrawing from Vietnam. At the May 1963 SecDef meeting, when McNamara asked for the withdrawal schedules. It's right there in black and white. You can't, and you know how bad it was? The New York Times even admitted that JFK had a plan to withdraw from Vietnam, but they did it in 1997, 6 years after they blasted the movie.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, in a way, it even goes beyond JFK. I mean, Oliver Stone and Jesse Ventura and others lived through that Vietnam era where People were lied to about the Gulf of Tonkin. There were so many lies told over and over again about the Vietnam War. And then you get into the Reagan years with Iran-Contra. I mean, why should people trust the institutions?
Well, Iran-Contra, this was something that I believe was, even after the investigations, I believe was covered up. This thing was such a huge scandal, that um you would literally take volumes to explain every single aspect of this thing, because it was so far flung, it was so pervasive, so many people, you really wonder. People criticize the JFK critics because they say, well, how could you keep a thing like that? Well, take a look at all the people who were involved in the Iran Contra affair. I mean, there must have been 70 people in the know about what was going on, but it took a long, long time to expose that. The late Robert Perry did that in a cover story in the New Republic, which, by the way, the New Republic was debating whether or not to print that story. All right, because Marty Peretz had a relationship with Elliot Abrams. All right. And so, but they finally did. And I think Jeff Morley had something to do with that. All right. Because he was working at the New Republic at that time. But even then, it wasn't until Gary Webb came along that we understood the full scope of what was really going on there. That they were sending down arms and bringing up cocaine, to supply the Contras, with this incredibly stupid war that they were running against the Sandinistas. All right. So that's another perfect example of what we're talking about. This is what the evils that secrecy does to an American society that doesn't know what the heck is really going on. So I totally agree with you. That's another parallel, which, like I said, I don't believe we ever got to the bottom of during those official investigations.
There were just two more things I wanted to cover here briefly, if we have a few more minutes, if you can. The first is I don't know if you can talk about this a little bit, but I don't think Oliver Stone gets nearly enough credit for the effect that his movie JFK had, because I think it does lead to the ARRB, and I think it leads to the release of documents that are important to our historical understanding. And he was crucified for that movie, but it was an important film at the very least because ultimately it got us documents that have enhanced our understanding of history.
Yeah, yes. And by the way, this is the only, you're a cinema aficionado, so you'll understand what I'm saying. This is the only film in the history of American cinema that was attacked 7 months before it came out. All right. And this attack wave went on all the way until its release. The New York Times published 34 stories on a film they hadn't seen yet. Okay. And not only that, but then when it came out, it was still being attacked. Even when Oliver went on TV, he went on Nightline. Okay. And he was attacked by Forrest Sawyer, all right, who I think is the ABC hitman on the assassinations of the 60s. All right. Um, so you have to wonder why? Why this? I believe, and again, I'll label this as speculation. I believe that the media wanted to exercise a preemptive strike against the film to bring questions about the film and Oliver before it was released, because they had a general idea of what the picture was going to be about, because it was based on Jim Garrison's book On the Trail of the Assassins, you know. Uh, and Oliver had to actually hire a PR guy, Frank Mankiewicz. And if you can believe it, well, first of all, to his credit, he replied to every major story in the MSM at that time. He even replied to the Washington Post. Okay. And he got in a reply uh, to their attack by George Lardner. All right. Mankiewicz had to get on the phone with Ben Bradley because they didn't want to print his reply. And they said, look, if you don't print my reply, I'm going to buy an ad in the Washington Post. And that's the way we'll have it in there. Okay. All right. And so this is the kind of battle that Oliver had to do with this movie. And like I said, the whole Vietnam issue, which he was bitterly attacked over, they were wrong and he was correct.
To add to that, since you've known Oliver for a while, how much did what role does that play in his sort of sense of wanting social justice and seeking out the truth? Because I'm very sympathetic when I read his memoir, just to understand his experiences, sort of trying to understand Vietnam, trying to understand lies like the Gulf of Tonkin. It seems like that really affected him and drove a lot of his desire for social justice and seeking the truth in politics.
Well, Oliver was really impacted by that whole Vietnam experience. All
Right,
right.
and
And
I think it's overlooked too often. Yeah.
yeah. And prior to JFK, his most famous film was Platoon, which is about his experience in Vietnam. All right. And if you read his memoir, which is the volume one, I think it's going to be a 3-volume set, he talks about that. And his very first student film was about a guy returning from Vietnam and trying to find a home in the United States and jobs, et cetera, things like that. All right. And I've talked to him about this more than once, and he was very disappointed. Well, that's an understatement about us being involved there, and B, the way the war was being run. All right. Uh, don't get him talking about Miss Moreland. Okay. He has nothing but scorn for General Westmoreland. If your listeners don't know, he was a guy that Johnson put in charge of the military operation in Vietnam. All right. And I actually think well, he's actually made 3 films about this. There was Platoon, JFK, and Heaven and Earth. All right. So yeah, this is definitely impacted who he is as a filmmaker and as a person. All right. Now, the whole Vietnam thesis of the film JFK, Oliver relied upon John Newman and Fletcher Prouty for that information because they were really, and well, I should give credit to Peter Dale Scott because he did a lot of good early work on that, you know. But they had the most input to that angle because Prouty was actually working on that, from the Pentagon to the White House, and John Newman had done a lot of research. All the work that Oliver did on that angle was referenced and was footnoted. So it was very unfair, the savage attack that he had to undergo on this.
If you have time for one or two more questions, I wanted to ask you, what do you think comes next with regards to these documents? And in conjunction with that, do you think some of these documents that could be uncovered soon are going to deal with Oswald in Mexico?
Okay, in answer to your first question, it takes a long time to read 77,000 pages. Okay. And I imagine that it's going to be a while before, we go through all this stuff. All right. Um, the answer to the second question is, from my understanding, from a couple of people who are at the National Archives, there were documents on Oswald in Mexico City that were still being withheld. And these guys went to the archives, I believe, before Tulsi Gabbard went ahead and declassified all this stuff. So I expect there to be stuff in there about Oswald in Mexico City. And from talking to me, you understand that I think that's a very, very important part of the case. And, well, to put it in a nutshell, there should have been 10 pictures of Oswald going into the Cuban and the Russian consulates. There were none.
For
Okay.
listeners that aren't familiar, why is the Mexico City connection so important?
Well, because on the day of the assassination, James Angleton's office issued this information about Oswald meeting with a gentleman named Valery Kostakov at the Russian embassy. And they said that Valery Kostakov was part of Department 13. And according to Angleton's office, Department 13 was responsible for liquidations inside the Western Hemisphere by the KGB. So you can't get very much more incriminating than that. Oswald killed JFK for the Russians. All right. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important. Now, if Oswald was not there, all right, then that changes the whole thing. That changes the whole calculus.
I also had to ask you about this moment at the hearing where Oliver Stone quoted James Angleton. And the
Wasn't
quote
that
was,
terrific?
yes, yeah, it was a very powerful moment. But for people that haven't seen it, Angleton said, if you were in a room with them, you were in a room full of people that you had to believe would deservedly end up in hell. I guess I will see them there soon. And that's like the spy master. That's the agency spy master. Why is that quote is so chilling? And you made point to reference it in your article about the experience. Can you talk a little bit about why you included that quote?
Well, like Oliver said, James Angleton was a Catholic. So he had this, Catholics are instilled with this sense of guilt. All right. And Angleton said this towards the end of his life. All right. And he's essentially saying that all these things that these guys did together were very serious mortal sins against humanity. All right. And although some of them had already died, like Alan Dulles, all right, he's essentially saying, and I was I was a part of it. Now, there's another quote by Angleton that I wish that Oliver would have said in conjunction with this, which I'm sure you're familiar with. During the church committee hearings, he said words to the effect that a mansion has many rooms. I was not privy to who struck John. The first time I read that, okay, my eyebrows arched up, all right, and I thought, is this Angleton trying to get himself off the hook for his part in the JFK assassination? Is he trying to blame it on some other department within the CIA that he was not aware? You put those two quotes together, all right, and I think it's really, really, really interesting.
In closing, I just wanted to give a final thought, and you can respond to it. But you know, I think that a lot of people need to understand this issue, these hearings, the release of these documents. This is not a partisan issue. I mean, I think you, Ollie, and I know Jefferson are not necessarily, you're not partisans of Trump. Our friend Lisa Pease is definitely not a Trump supporter. This isn't about Trump, though. And I really want my listeners to understand that. This is about a need for transparency. And if this hearing and the release of these documents provide that opportunity, then good. That's what I think.
Well, that's an issue that I addressed, in my opening statement. This is not a partisan issue. And I don't know why the Democrats are making it that way. You know, I believe everyone should be interested in an open government, in freedom from secrecy, because time after time, as we have seen, especially through contemporary American history, It's been this kind of secrecy, that has been destructive to, you know, I don't even know if you call what we have left a democracy. Okay. I guess you can call it a republic. Okay. Whether it's a democracy is another issue. All right. But I believe it's eroded the roots of people's belief in government. And shorthand, because I just had this debate with a friend of mine. It's too long an equation to address just in a couple of minutes on your show. But I believe this decline has led to two things: the disintegration of the Democratic Party, which is nothing like it used to be. All right. And secondly, the radicalization of the GOP. All right. Now, how they got there is something we can spend a long time discussing. But I believe those are two of the direct political results of what this has done, this loss of belief, which I believe is absolutely justified, okay, of people in their government and also people in their media representatives.
And I also I was thinking of this earlier, but I forgot to mention it. You mentioned to me, and I mentioned to you before the show. Ben Shapiro has been going around
Oh my
slinging mud
God. Oh,
at.
please.
Well, I have to ask about this because he's going around saying, "Why should anyone care about this event that happened, 60 years ago?" To which I respond, "Well, Ben, you talk about World War II a lot, or you talk about slavery, or you talk about like, should we not talk about those events then? Oh, they happened a long time ago." It's ridiculous to me, and I just wanted you to give your response because it's so bizarre that this guy has a following.
Okay. I think he tried to say two things: that since it was a long ago event, it didn't matter. And somehow there wasn't any evidence that there was a conspiracy and a cover up. Well, first of all, like you just said, the JFK assassination, even though it happened 60 years ago, is one of these cases that will not go away, for very good reasons. And one of the reasons I mentioned on the during the hearing, 90% of the public believes that as a result of that case, America went from being a country bathed in triumph and optimism out of World War II to being one bathed in cynicism and skepticism. The biggest 1 year drop was the year the Warren Commission report came out. I don't think that's a coincidence. So that's why it has a malingering effect over contemporary society. As for the evidence, oh, come on, please, Ben. If you don't know anything about something, you shouldn't open your mouth about it. All right. I mean, the things that we mentioned and during the hearing, that is the falsity of Commission Exhibit 399, the magic bullet, plus the 42 witnesses at both Parkland and Bethesda who saw this blasted out hole in the back of Kennedy's skull. I mean, at any kind of trial, at any kind of hearing, all right, uh, CE 399 will get you thrown out of court because there is no chain of custody on it. And by the way, I'm not saying that as Oliver mentioned. We had Henry Lee say that, how important chain of custody is at any trial or hearing. So if Ben doesn't know what he's saying, or if he just doesn't give two nickels about it, he should just be quiet instead of making a fool out of himself.
There's one more aspect to that, and I know I've kept you long, but the other thing he keeps saying in all his videos where he talks about the Kennedy assassination, which he's been doing a lot lately, he keeps saying, and it's these left-wing conspiracy theorists that have led to right-wing conspiracy theories like QAnon. And that upsets me because you know what? John Bircher nuts were around in the 60s. And you know what? You guys aren't, people like yourself, Jim, people like Oliver Stone, they're not John Birchers.
This is something that really gets me angry, is because QAnon is not a left wing phenomenon. All right. It's really a right wing kind of phenomenon. And it's not evidence based at all, period. These people believe in things that, I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. On the other hand, people like me, that's the kind of work we do. we try to present evidence that you could actually submit in a court of law. These QAnon people will get thrown out of court the first day, and for Ben to, and this, by the way, this has been a popular parlor game, with these intelligentsia people on the conservative side to try and link QAnon with because simply they don't want to have to deal with the facts of the JFK assassination. So they smear us with this whole QAnon thing. Now, let me add one qualifier before I leave. There are conservative people, and I believe Anna Luna is one of them, who honestly do believe in a fact-based alternative to the JFK case. All right. Okay. There are people like that. And to be perfectly frank, I didn't even know Anna Luna till I met her. Okay. So she probably comes by this by some other sources besides myself and Jeff Morley and Oliver Stone. I mean, anybody who examines the evidence in the JFK case in any honest way is going to have a lot of questions about what happened.
Well, I want to let you get going, but how can my listeners keep up with the work you're doing? Kennedy's and King, right?
All right. The website is kennedysandking.com. I have a Substack under my name. My latest book is the JFK Assassination Chokeholds, which you can get on Amazon or Abbey Books, or any big major seller. All right. And I don't know, did I say this? JFK Revisited is back in the top 10 on the on Amazon bestsellers. Yeah, bestsellers, awesome. Documentaries. All right. Thank you for having me on.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.